And welcome to another edition of the Nerdy Agent Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Pettersen, with my brothers and fellow nerds, AJ and Josh. We are all here today. It's the first day of school. Did the kids get to school?
I have my mug with my kids on it.
Did they get to school?
They did. They made it.
They made it to school?
Yep.
Are you sure?
Yep.
They made it. They made it. That's good.
My kids today, it's funny because they were up at they were ready at 6:45. So they woke us up basically.
Because they were excited?
They were so nervous, excited. There's a lot of energy.
Excited.
Ava literally got out of bed, got dressed, and got into our bedroom before Chris and I were out of bed.
Ava's outfit was next level cool.
Yep.
The other really good one was, I think the older kids definitely took the cake today. Holden was wearing an entire soccer outfit.
No, it's not an outfit. It's called a kit.
Oh, it is called a kit. You're right.
How is his form, AJ?
His form's phenomenal.
And
by form, we obviously don't mean his actual form of doing an activity. It just means how energetic and how well he's been playing, and it's really good.
They said, Caitlin opened up her phone and goes, Holden looks like a soccer player. I said, what do you mean?
Yeah, he's fresh off the IL. Broken finger, dropped a dumbbell on his finger.
Yep.
But his cast is gone, and his form's great.
That's fantastic. Well, this week on the Nerdy Agent Podcast, we want to talk about all things settlement changes, what we've seen in the last 3 weeks. I know it was about a month ago we gave you a rundown on what was going to happen and what we were thinking we were going to do based on the changes that were going to go into place. But now we're going to, having been almost 3 weeks into this, let you know what we're seeing, what our team is seeing, and how we've been kind of handling that. So I think we're going to hit on a few different topics. The first one, I think, buyer reps would be what we should probably start with. So for those who have been living under a rock, you now have to get a buyer agreement in order to tour a house, or else you can be fined and eventually lose your license. I believe it's a pretty big deal. And so we're having to get these before seeing houses. And so this has been obviously changing the process. Do you want to talk about what that's been like?
Yeah, well, we talked, everyone that listens to this for the most part knows of our relationship with Zillow too, and the number of leads that we get coming through. So we get 400 a month. Our phone rings, or a client wants to see a house that our agents don't know. And so this was the biggest change that we were, I think, concerned about on the front end, was trying to make sure that we could get these agreements in place before scheduling that first showing, given that it's a cold lead that our agent doesn't know. And so we worked with Zillow, and they put out that touring agreement. And so all of our agents are working for that first showing with that touring agreement, but it does force our agents to actually then be better and get to a buyer meeting, and then go through everything at the buyer meeting, and then get a buyer rep signed at that point in time, and then work forward with that client. I think it's going to force our agents to be, I think I said this on the front end, I thought it was going to force our agents to be better agents. You don't just run around showing houses and opening doors. You have to actually explain the process in order to get that second agreement. But what I've been pleasantly surprised by here is when that first weekend happened, we all sat down and we're like, this weekend's gonna be crazy. The number of calls that we're gonna get being like, oh, they didn't sign this, or oh, I came to the house and I didn't have the touring agreement with me, or right, or it's not loading through Zillow or whatever. We've had very limited issues. I mean, compared to a normal week, I think our general call velocity of agents, concerns, questions, issues is about the same as before we made these changes. And so that's been really nice. I think part of it goes to how much effort was put in the front end to ensure that our agents were prepared for this, but also on the back end, the processes and things and systems that we were all afraid were going to be really chaotic or difficult to get agents into contracts. It was not as scary as what we, potentially thought, or what a lot of people thought was going to happen.
I mean, we had an agent sign. Justin on our team signed 8 buyer reps the first week with people he had been working with, or people that he had picked up after the changes on the 15th. So pretty crazy. But I think, to that end, Josh, the biggest thing that I think it was Luke had the idea is we made it so that there's some language we can put in there that puts the contract fully in the control of the buyer. This whole settlement has come out and they've said, this is consumer friendly. This is pro-consumer. So our stance has been, how do we make our response to that as pro-consumer as possible? We've talked about often that a lot of agents made responses out of fear and anger, and it was about them. They were afraid they were going to lose business, or people were going to screw them or whatever. And we've always just taken the stance of, let's treat every single person we run into as well as possible, like we did in the past. And with the new changes, let's just do everything as pro-consumer as we possibly can, because that's what's going to lead us to win now and in the future.
And I know a lot of people who listen to this podcast, well, just about all of them probably aren't on this Zillow program that we are on. So they're doing mostly the Sphere business. And personally, that exact script and letting them know that it's in their control has had no pushback personally for me. One of the other things I've instituted now is I actually printed out the agency and buyer rep contract and highlighted it.
Yep.
And I go through it like a title company at the buyer meeting because I'm like, you're going to have to sign this. This is what this says. And they've all just signed it. With no issue.
It's been, I think, so I've always said this, like from the start to AJ's point, right? I never made people sign buyer representation contracts in the past. I used to show houses for as long as they wanted without any sort of representation. I know a lot of agents say that's crazy. But the reality is like, I don't ever want anyone to feel like they're forced to work with me or they were tricked into working with me or, that they're working with me, but it's not their choice. And so when we get to the point of offering is when I used to have buyer representation contracts signed. But even when I had those signed, I would send them a note, with the overview of everything in the offer. And on that, I would say, if you ever want to stop working with me, just let me know and I will rip this up. And I've never had anyone ask to do that. I've never had anyone screw me and try to buy a house without me that wasn't under a buyer rep. Like it's never happened. So under the new rules, we started talking about it. We're like, we have to get these representation contracts signed because that's the new reality of our business. But we can do it in a way where we can kind of have the same relationship. So to AJ's point with the language that we added, it just says, buyer can expire this contract at any point in time by sending a written communication unilaterally. Roughly, it's the language. Because then I can tell every buyer that I meet, like, hey, I didn't used to make people sign these, but now I have to in order to show you homes. It's the new reality of how we operate. That said, I don't like that I have to have a contract that makes you be locked in for a period of time. So I've added this language at the end of the contract so that if you ever decide you don't like me, you can just send me an email and you are out of the contract at that point in time. And we are done. The relationship is over. You owe me nothing at that point.
I honestly believe that with these contracts, the hardest thing for me has been keeping track of who signed them and who hasn't.
Yeah. Process-wise, it's a little more complicated.
Yeah.
On the back end, I'm like all capitalizing my people in the pipeline when they've signed it. And then I have to make a folder for them before they're under contract on a house and put the docs in there.
That's why everything was all capped in fun.
Ryan and Jolene.
I saw that. Yeah.
That's the new process.
I like that.
If they're all caps, it means they've
that.
signed it. So I know the difference because there's too many people to keep track of otherwise. So outside of the buyer contracts, I think the other big one, again, if you've been living under a rock or if you just don't show houses, maybe you're not in the MLS, they removed the broker compensation field at the bottom of every single listing. So it doesn't state what a seller is offering to a buyer broker or what the listing brokerage is co-oping to the buyer broker. But we've been tracking this data. So I think we want to talk about what it's looked like, what the commissions, have they changed, where they're roughly at right now.
Yeah, so we have our team over in the Philippines right now doing a great job for us on this. We're going to keep working on the process to make sure we're being as agent friendly as well in terms of not spamming people. But the goal was to continue to get an understanding of how commissions were tracking after the commission field disappeared, right? Because we have historically tracked commission rate, what percentage of transactions are paying out and what brackets. But we wanted to understand going forward if that was changing under the new structure. And at this point in time, what we've seen in the first 3 weeks is we haven't seen any actual dip in the number of the percentage of commissions that are being paid out at the higher rates. Because I think on the front end, that's the one I still see it in all these different Facebook groups. But people are like, well, what if my buyer can't afford to pay my commission and they're paying a zero? Should I even bring them to the house? And then I should ask before. And once again, the fear is leading in a lot of those conversations versus just saying, I'm going to show every single house. I know that 95% of homes are paying out 2.5 or higher. And even in the 5% where they're not, it's all negotiable, right? So I can just write it into my offer at this point and say, this is my commission rate. This is what you're paying out. And if they say no, then we can move on to the next one. But we haven't really seen any sort of change in terms of sellers' willingness to pay out buyers' agents' commissions, which I think that was when this all started, that was probably the biggest fear was, well, sellers are just going to start paying zero and we're not going to get paid anymore. And our buyers are going to have to pay us and they're not going to be willing to, or they're not going to be able to afford to, or all of those different things. A lot of those fears, as usually is the case, right? That the fear becomes a lot bigger than the reality. What we're seeing play out at this point is that it's pretty status quo in terms of compensation. It's just the process for getting there has changed in a way that, in my mind, actually has created more transparency and is a good thing for consumers.
Well, and truthfully, I mean, that leads into the next thing we were going to talk about, which is the co-op payouts versus the seller direct. And so, I'll do a refresher on that. EXP, our brokerage, has taken the stance that the listing agent and the seller should not determine the percentage amount up front at a listing appointment or at the time of signing a listing contract. A lot of brokerages here locally are saying, no, we're going to keep doing it how we did it before, and we're going to have a total compensation, and then part of that compensation is going to be used to pay the buyer's broker out of the listing broker's total take, right? And so they're just saying, we're going to keep it the same way. States like California outlawed co-op commissions. That hasn't happened yet here in Minnesota, and so EXP on our listings is making us not do that, which I think is the right move. And when people come to me and say, are you paying out a buyer's agent commission? I say, put it in the offer. Seller is open to all offers. I'll present everything. And we'll look at it on a case-by-case basis, basically, because it's a net number at the end of the day. But in EXP, from our listings, we have to have it in the purchase agreement in Minnesota, what is line 406, which spells out a percentage or a dollar amount that the seller is directly paying to the buyer's broker versus the payout coming from the listing broker's total take. And so there's been a lot of confusion and conversations around that. In fact, I would say that's probably been the biggest confusing point for people of how does this all work? Where should we put these numbers? Who should this be disclosed to, right? Because obviously, again, in this settlement, the disclosure wasn't super transparent in a lot of states across the country. Here in Minnesota, buyers should know by the time they get to that point in the conversation what their buyer's broker their agent's brokerage is being compensated, what that number is, what amount they're paying directly to the buyer broker, if any, and the seller should know the exact same thing. So it should be really transparent and clear on a transactional basis. But the co-op versus direct from seller has been a point of contention, I think, and it's really just a broker conversation because they're the ones that are leading the charge on what their agents should be doing.
Do you think that that's going to change? It's going to become direct from seller?
Yeah, I think the co-op is probably going to go away. It's creating confusion.
It seems like it's a national, like EXP being a national brokerage, they have to take a much more like 30,000 foot view of a lot of this stuff versus some of the more local brokerages are probably playing more within the rules of Minnesota, and that's why they're kind of having this conflict that exists.
There aren't many national brokerages that are of the size of EXP. For those that don't know, most brokerages are actually on a franchise basis. So, your Remaxes, your Berkshire Hathaways, Keller Williams of the world, they're franchised, and so there's different, territories essentially where they're really truly different brokerages. Here in Minnesota locally, Remax Results is the biggest one. But if you look at Keller Williams, like there's probably 20 Keller Williams brokerages, and they're like Lakes Realty, they're Northwest names. Suburbs. They're like, they have all these different names and they might have different ownership structures. And so they're the ones providing the guidance to their agents at a local level. And to Josh's point, not necessarily at a national level, even though they might be receiving some guidance from the overarching brand that they're underneath.
And I think the note to agents is like, we're going to communicate this the way that our brokerage wants us to. So if someone's trying to buy one of our listings, we'll say, ideally you would do it this way, right? So put it in that line 406, that will be the compensation. Seller will be aware of that, and then they'll be aware that they're paying that directly to the buyer's broker, because our brokerage is going to probably, give us a little bit of a hard time if it's in a different spot.
No, they won't allow it.
They won't allow it.
Right. But the goal is, in every case, not letting, what I tell people is, don't let the brokerages and their way of doing things stop consumers from getting what they need, right? Let's get deals under contract. Let's move people forward in a way that's going to continue to help people buy and sell real estate. And then we'll let the brokerages kind of sort it out on the back end, right? So if their brokerage is saying we only do co-op, our brokerage is saying we don't do co-op, don't let that stop a buyer from getting a house. Let's figure out how to do it in a way that we think is going to work, and then we can always amend things after the fact to make the brokerages happy.
And I think what we've talked about too is, when this all changed, you look at what angles can I take that are going to be advantageous for my clients, right? So what's pro-consumer, and further, what's pro-client, especially on the seller side. And so when people ask that question and you say, my seller told me they would pay this much and it's a fixed number, well, now you've just the number that's the floor of what they're going to offer you in their offer, right?
Yep.
Whereas what if my listing gets multiple offers and, a brother is representing a sister on the buy side and they're like, oh, we'll do it for 1%. Well, now whatever that number was that we determined up front, if it's 1% versus 2.5, 2, 3, whatever the number is, the seller has just maybe saved a bunch of money in paying out those commissions. So by not tipping your hand early, you actually benefit your seller. But we're obviously still gathering these on the buyer side. And mostly it's just so that, like Josh mentioned, we have those buckets of payouts so we can compare things and have better conversations with buyers and sellers about what expectations they should have, because we've determined that expectations, there's so many expectations to set with a client up front, along the way, what's coming next. This is just another expectation that we're having to add in. And so to have data to back up the expectation is super, super helpful.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful to sit in a buyer meeting and say, hey, the new rules have changed. So now we have to have a contract saying that if they're not paying a commission, you're paying me 2.7%.
Or three, or
three,
two,
or whatever.
or
Yeah,
five,
or whatever.
1.
But if I charge that for my services, to then be able to say, but we are tracking all of the data of everything that's been paid out, and here is the percentages that are being paid out on average by listing. That's pretty powerful to be like, okay, the average listing is paying out 2.65 or 2.7 right now. So therefore, most of the listings we come across, that amount will be something that the seller is open to working with you on. Once again, you're using data to take out a roadblock that exists in this setup on the front end.
It's no different than before, like in 2021, when we would say, hey, there's only 5,000 homes on the market. And in your price point, there's even, less per capita, if you will, per buyer. It's going to be super, super competitive. But rather than just saying, it's really hot and competitive out there, you actually backed it up with an actual number.
Yep.
Right? That's real and factual.
And you're answering the objection before they even ask it in that case. And I think that's why every time I've presented this, they're just like, okay, nobody even really has questions. Mm-hmm. That's all we have this week on the Nerdy Agent Podcast. And as always, remember, be better